I said no to my sister's $120,000 dream. So my parents took me to court. My parents looked at me like the answer was obvious. Your sister needs money to chase her dream, my mom said, and you just sold your apartment. I took a slow breath before answering. I'm not sacrificing my future to pay for someone else's dream. They didn't argue right away. Instead, they sued me. I never imagined my own family would take me to court over money, but that's exactly what happened. Looking back, I realized that moment was only the beginning of something that completely changed my life. For 6 straight years, I lived as frugally as I possibly could. I picked up double shifts at Memorial Hospital, counted every dollar I earned, and survived on instant ramen more nights than I'd like to admit. Every small sacrifice had one purpose. I wanted to build a future I could depend on. Eventually, all that hard work paid off when I sold my apartment. Growing up, money was always a source of stress in our house. My parents argued constantly over unpaid bills, overdue notices piled up on the kitchen table, and I remember seeing my mom cry more than once because she didn't know how we were going to make ends meet. Whenever things got especially difficult, my dad had a habit of disappearing for a few days until the pressure eased. Living through that kind of instability taught me an important lesson early in life. Financial independence wasn't simply something nice to have. To me, it meant security. It meant survival. When I was 22 and finally earned my nursing license, I managed to scrape together enough money for the down payment on a tiny one-bedroom apartment. It wasn't fancy by any stretch of the imagination, but it belonged to me. Every mortgage payment reminded me that I was building something my parents had never been able to achieve. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, my realtor Monica called with news I could hardly believe. A cash buyer had offered exactly $185,000, matching the property's appraised value after years of improvements I'd made. Once the mortgage balance, commissions, and closing costs were paid, I walked away with $94,500. I'd never had that much money in my life. The best part was that I already knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. My plan was to buy a duplex, live in one unit, and rent out the other. The rental income would cover most of the mortgage while the property built equity over time. It wasn't some unrealistic fantasy. I'd spent months researching the numbers, talking with professionals, and carefully planning every step. It was an investment strategy, not wishful thinking. I shared the good news during our family's monthly dinner. Mom congratulated me, although something about her voice felt forced. Dad barely acknowledged what I'd said, and my younger sister Rose hardly looked away from her phone. I should have recognized those reactions as a warning. Whenever something good happened to me, my family always found a way to make it complicated. About 2 weeks later, I got a text from Rose. Family meeting tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Important business opportunity. Don't be late. That message alone felt strange. Rose had never shown the slightest interest in business. She was 24 years old, still living with our parents, and had earned a visual arts degree that she rarely used after graduation. While I'd spent nursing school working 60-hour weeks just to survive, she'd been taking pottery classes and backpacking across Europe using money our parents happily provided. The next afternoon, I walked into my childhood home and immediately knew this wasn't going to be a normal conversation. Rose stood proudly beside an easel covered with poster boards, glossy photographs, magazine clippings, and colorful presentation materials. Mom and Dad sat on the couch, smiling at her like proud investors waiting for a big announcement. Rose clapped her hands excitedly. "I finally found my calling," she said. "I'm opening an art gallery." Then she launched into a full presentation. She explained that she'd found a boutique storefront in the downtown arts district. The rent alone was $8,000 every month. On top of that, she'd need renovations, artwork, insurance, advertising, and startup inventory. Then, almost casually, she announced the total amount she needed: $120,000. Mom and Dad looked nervous when they heard the number, but neither of them questioned whether the business would actually succeed. Rose confidently claimed the gallery would be profitable within 6 months. She had charts, colorful graphs, and financial projections that looked impressive at first glance. But the more she explained them, the more obvious it became that they were built almost entirely on optimism instead of real experience. She had never managed a business. She'd never handled inventory. She'd never balanced a business budget. She'd never worked retail. Yet somehow, she spoke with complete certainty as if success were guaranteed. The most unsettling part wasn't listening to Rose convince herself. It was watching my parents believe every single word. The following Sunday, Mom invited me back for what she described as a family financial discussion. When I arrived, the dining room looked more like the meeting room of a corporation than a family home. Rose had expanded her presentation into a thick binder filled with market research, projected earnings, competitor analysis, and detailed information about the location she wanted. She enthusiastically explained why the Arts District was the perfect place and insisted the gallery would break even within 8 months. As I carefully looked through the numbers, the flaws became obvious. Nearly every comparison she used involved successful galleries that had been operating for decades. She was assuming she'd immediately perform like businesses that had spent years building reputations and loyal customers. Eventually, Dad admitted something important. They didn't actually have the money. Mom suggested they could borrow against the house, but quickly admitted they didn't want to risk losing it. That's when everything suddenly made sense. Rose leaned toward me with a cheerful smile. "You just sold your apartment," she said. "You have the money." Mom immediately chimed in. "It isn't really spending your money," she explained. "It's an investment." Dad nodded in agreement. "This is a family opportunity," he said. "If it succeeds, everyone benefits." I honestly couldn't believe what I was hearing. They expected me to hand over the savings I'd spent 6 exhausting years building, so my sister could gamble on a business she'd never run before. I calmly closed the business plan and placed it back on the table. "I'm not investing in the gallery." The room instantly fell silent. Rose stared at me in complete disbelief. Mom frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I said," I answered. Rose insisted she'd done extensive research. I reminded her that she'd never managed a business, never held a job longer than 6 months, had absolutely no experience in the industry, and didn't even have a backup plan if things went wrong. Dad shook his head. "You're being too harsh," he said. "Everybody has to start somewhere." "Sure," I replied. "But starting somewhere shouldn't require risking someone else's entire life savings." Rose immediately burst into tears. "You don't believe in my dreams." "I believe in dreams," I told her. "I don't believe in fantasies." I explained that new businesses fail all the time, and art galleries have an even higher failure rate than most startups. Mom waved away everything I said. Rose isn't like everybody else. I reminded them that being talented as an artist wasn't the same thing as knowing how to operate a successful business. Then I asked Rose a few simple questions. Had she ever managed suppliers, handled business taxes, tracked inventory, dealt with unhappy customers? She admitted she hadn't, but insisted she'd figure it out as she went. "With my money there to catch you if you fail?" I asked. Dad tried appealing to family loyalty. Families help each other. That was the moment I completely lost my patience. I reminded all of them that no one had helped me through nursing school. I worked multiple jobs, survived on cheap food, struggled to make mortgage payments, and sacrificed years of my life to build financial stability. Everything I'd achieved came from hard work and personal sacrifice. Meanwhile, Rose had spent those same years living comfortably at home without paying rent. Mom insisted our situations weren't comparable because I'd chosen a practical career. "No," I answered. "The difference is that I accepted responsibility for my future, and Rose never had to." Rose accused me of punishing her simply because she was creative. I looked at her and said, If this gallery is really such a great investment, then a bank should have no problem financing it. Dad quietly admitted that no bank would approve the loan because Rose had neither experience nor collateral. I looked around the table. That should tell you everything you need to know. Then I stood up from my chair. This conversation is over. I'm not investing, and I'm not changing my mind. As I walked toward the front door, my mom called after me. You're selfish. I stopped at the door and turned back one last time. I spent 6 years earning every single dollar I have, I said. I'm not throwing all of that away on a business that's built on wishful thinking. Rose wiped away her tears. Art is my passion. I don't doubt that, I answered, but passion isn't a business plan. Then I walked out. As I drove home, I realized I'd done more than refuse an investment. I'd started a full-blown family war. The next month became one of the most emotionally draining periods of my life. My family seemed determined to break me down until I finally gave in. Mom called me constantly, even while I was working at the hospital. Nearly every conversation ended with her crying about how devastated Rose had become. She insisted I was destroying my sister's future and repeated over and over that Rose was a sensitive artist whose dreams were slipping away because of me. Dad took a completely different approach. One evening, he showed up at my apartment carrying my favorite Thai takeout, hoping a calm conversation would change my mind. He patiently explained that investing in Rose's gallery could earn me far more money than buying a duplex ever would. I reminded him that my real estate plan was based on months of research, financial analysis, and proven investment principles. Rose's gallery, on the other hand, was built almost entirely on optimism. When neither guilt nor logic worked, they expanded the campaign. Soon, other relatives started contacting me. My Aunt Patricia called to tell me how disappointed she was in what she called my selfish behavior. My cousin Jake accused me of putting money ahead of family and destroying the unity we'd always had. Rose flooded my phone with articles about successful art galleries, screenshots of encouraging messages from her friends, and emotional voice recordings insisting I was the only thing standing between her and the future she deserved. 3 weeks later, after finishing an exhausting 12-hour shift at the hospital, I unlocked my apartment door and immediately froze. My parents and Rose were sitting inside my living room. They had convinced the building manager there was a family emergency, and somehow they'd been allowed inside. My coffee table had disappeared beneath stacks of business articles, printed testimonials, financial reports, and yet another revised version of Rose's business plan. Dad smiled as if this were perfectly normal and handed me another folder. Rose immediately pointed to a newspaper article about a woman whose art gallery had become incredibly successful. I skimmed the story for less than a minute before spotting the obvious difference. The owner had spent 15 years working for established galleries before opening her own business. Rose had absolutely nothing close to that level of experience. When I pointed it out, Mom accused me of deliberately trying to crush her. Almost instantly, Rose broke into dramatic sobs. "You hate me," she cried. "You care more about money than your own family." For just a second, I wondered if maybe I really was being too harsh. But then I remembered every other time Rose had used tears, guilt, and emotional manipulation to avoid taking responsibility whenever life became difficult. That moment of doubt disappeared. I looked at all three of them. "You need to leave." No one moved, so I raised my voice. "Get out, all of you." Eventually, they gathered their things and walked out, but that wasn't the end of it. The phone calls continued. The text messages kept coming. Emails filled my inbox. They even showed up unexpectedly at my apartment more than once. Eventually, I'd had enough. I blocked every phone number I could think of and changed the locks just to make sure no one could get inside again. For exactly 1 week, everything was quiet. Then I was handed legal papers while I was on my lunch break at the hospital. Standing alone in the break room, I opened the envelope and felt my stomach drop. My parents, and Rose as a co-plaintiff were officially suing me. According to the lawsuit, I had violated what they called family financial obligations and had been unjustly enriched by my success. Their argument was almost impossible to believe. Because I'd lived at home until I was 19 and had benefited from food, housing, and parental support while growing up, they claimed that part of my financial success legally belonged to them. Based on that reasoning, they demanded $120,000 from the proceeds of my apartment sale, the exact amount Rose wanted for her gallery. As if that wasn't enough, they also claimed I'd caused Rose emotional and financial damages simply by refusing to invest in her business. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I left work early that afternoon and started searching for an attorney. After meeting with several lawyers who charged expensive consultation fees, I finally found someone who immediately inspired confidence. His name was Marcus Rodriguez, a family business attorney who had spent years handling disputes between relatives. He carefully reviewed every page of the lawsuit before slowly shaking his head. "The legal claims are extremely weak," he said. He explained that parents are legally required to provide for their minor children. Adult children are under no obligation to repay their parents simply for being raised. He also made it clear that refusing to invest in a sibling's business creates absolutely no legal responsibility. Still, he warned me not to underestimate what my family was doing. Even lawsuits with almost no chance of winning can become expensive, he explained. Sometimes people file them simply to pressure someone into settling, because defending yourself costs money. His initial retainer was $5,000. Paying it meant postponing my plans to buy a duplex. Even so, I never considered giving up. Before I left his office, Marcus shared one more interesting observation. He'd researched the attorney representing my parents. In his opinion, the case existed only because someone had been willing to accept money to file paperwork that probably should never have reached a courtroom. The following morning, I officially hired him. By then, this fight wasn't really about Rose's gallery anymore. It had become something much bigger. It was about deciding whether I'd spend the rest of my life letting my family dictate my financial future. Marcus immediately got to work documenting every piece of evidence that proved I'd been financially independent. We collected years of bank statements, tuition records, rent receipts, mortgage paperwork, tax returns, employment records, and every document showing I'd supported myself since leaving home. Seeing everything laid out together was surprisingly emotional. Over 6 years, I'd paid more than $180,000 in tuition, housing, transportation, and everyday living expenses without receiving financial help from anyone. The discovery process also uncovered something my parents hadn't expected us to find. They had borrowed $35,000 against their house. The money wasn't just funding Rose's gallery. It was also paying for the lawsuit against me. Their financial situation was far worse than I'd realized. Meanwhile, Rose refused to accept reality. Instead of abandoning her idea, she opened a much smaller version of the gallery anyway. Unable to afford the expensive downtown location she'd originally wanted, she rented a tiny storefront in a nearly empty strip mall where very few people ever walked by. She painted the walls herself, installed inexpensive lighting, and tried to create an upscale atmosphere using secondhand furniture. When opening day finally arrived, only about 15 people showed up. Most of them were family friends. Over the following weeks, I noticed her social media posts changing. The excitement slowly disappeared. In its place came constant promotions, discounts, and increasingly desperate attempts to attract customers. While Rose struggled to sell artwork, I kept moving forward with my own plans. I continued searching for duplexes, secured a pre-approved loan, and focused on investment opportunities that actually made financial sense. Marcus kept me informed as the case moved through the legal system. My parents' attorney repeatedly tried delaying the proceedings, obviously hoping that rising legal costs would pressure me into settling. Instead, every new filing made our position even stronger. My records painted a clear picture of years of responsible financial independence. Their records told a very different story: growing debt, personal loans, maxed out credit cards, one reckless financial decision after another, all because they refused to accept a simple fact. I had every right to say no. 3 months after being served with the lawsuit, I no longer worried about whether I'd win. What frightened me most was realizing what the lawsuit had revealed about the people I'd spent my entire life calling family. 8 months after they first filed the case, the day of the hearing finally arrived. Marcus was already waiting outside the courthouse when I arrived. Before we went inside, he explained how the hearing would likely unfold. The judge's first priority would be deciding whether my parents' claims had any legitimate legal foundation before anything else moved forward. Across the hallway, my parents stood with Rose and their attorney. Even under the circumstances, Rose somehow managed to dress as though she were attending the grand opening of an upscale art exhibit. She wore a dramatic black dress that looked completely out of place in a courtroom. Mom had chosen her favorite church dress. Dad wore the same suit he'd proudly worn to my nursing school graduation years earlier. When our case was called, we all took our seats. Their attorney stood first. He argued that because my parents had provided me with food, housing, and financial support throughout my childhood, they deserved to benefit from the success I'd achieved as an adult. According to him, those years of support had allowed me to build wealth, and by refusing to help fund Rose's gallery, I had violated an unspoken family obligation. Judge Patricia Chen didn't look convinced. Almost immediately, she interrupted him. "Are you seriously arguing," she asked, "that an adult child has a legal obligation to finance a sibling's business venture?" The attorney tried to shift his argument toward unjust enrichment and reciprocal family responsibility, but every answer he gave only seemed to weaken his own case. Then Marcus stood. Methodically, he walked the judge through years of documentation. He presented my bank statements, my tuition records, mortgage payments, employment history, tax documents. Every piece of evidence showed exactly the same thing. Everything I owned had been earned through my own hard work. Marcus also made another point that seemed impossible to argue against. Parents are legally required to support their children while they're minors. Fulfilling that responsibility doesn't create a lifelong financial debt. If that were true, Marcus explained, then every financially successful adult could eventually be sued by their parents, simply for becoming independent. Judge Chen nodded thoughtfully before turning back toward the opposing attorney. "Can you provide even one legal precedent supporting this theory?" The courtroom became noticeably quiet. He shuffled through his files, searched his notes, and looked increasingly uncomfortable. In the end, he couldn't produce a single example. The judge then allowed my parents to speak. Dad talked about loyalty and family responsibility. Mom cried as she described how devastated Rose had become after losing the opportunity to pursue her dream. Rose insisted she had only wanted the chance to build something meaningful with her life before accusing me of caring more about money than my own family. When the judge finally looked at me, I kept my statement simple. "I earned every dollar I saved through years of hard work," I said. "No one else has the right to decide how I invest my money." That was all I needed to say. About 12 minutes later, Judge Chen returned with her decision. The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice. That meant the case was over permanently. They could never file the same claim again. On top of that, my parents were ordered to reimburse my legal expenses. As we walked out of the courthouse, Marcus smiled. "I knew the case was weak," he admitted. "I just didn't realize it was that weak." Legally, I'd won. Emotionally, it didn't feel much like a victory. My own parents had taken me to court simply because I refused to finance my sister's unrealistic business idea. Before I even made it home, my phone started buzzing nonstop. Mom left a tearful voicemail blaming me for destroying the family. Dad insisted I'd sacrificed our relationships over money. Rose claimed I'd crushed her dreams forever. I listened to none of it. Every message stayed unanswered. That evening, my coworker Cassie showed up with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine to celebrate. She looked at me and said something I desperately needed to hear. Healthy families don't sue each other because someone refuses to fund a risky business. She was absolutely right. Still, knowing she was right didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. Not long afterward, my parents contacted me through Marcus. Since the court had ordered them to pay my legal fees, they asked whether they could repay the money in monthly installments instead of one lump sum because they simply couldn't afford it. I agreed without hesitation. I wasn't interested in taking everything they had. I certainly didn't want to be responsible for them losing their house. Money had never been the real issue. The real damage had already been done. Word about the lawsuit spread quickly throughout our extended family. Unfortunately, the story changed along the way. Instead of telling people they had sued me over $120,000, the version everyone heard was that I'd abandoned my sister and refused to support her lifelong artistic dream. Rose carefully shaped that narrative online. She posted emotional updates about chasing her passion while conveniently leaving out the lawsuit and her demand for my apartment money. Meanwhile, her gallery performed almost exactly the way I'd expected. The poor location, the weak business model, her complete lack of experience. Together, they resulted in almost no sales. 6 months after the trial ended, I finally accomplished the goal I'd been working toward from the very beginning. I closed on the duplex. After my upstairs tenant moved in, the rental income covered most of the monthly mortgage payment exactly as I'd planned. For the first time in years, I felt financially secure. I'd protected the future I'd worked so hard to build. The cost, however, had been nearly every family relationship I'd once treasured. 8 months after opening its doors, Rose's gallery quietly shut down. Cassie was actually the first person to notice. She happened to drive past the storefront one afternoon and called to tell me the windows were empty. The business was simply gone. Later, I learned what had really happened. Rose had burned through nearly $40,000 in borrowed money while selling only a few $1,000s worth of artwork. She still owed money to several artists. She had fallen behind on rent. Eventually, she abandoned the space altogether. My parents had financed almost everything by borrowing against their home and maxing out multiple credit cards. Now, they were facing foreclosure. One afternoon, I ran into my former neighbor, Mrs. Kim. She quietly told me she'd seen my mother recently. According to her, Mom looked completely exhausted and admitted they might lose the house. Hearing that hit me harder than I expected. That house had been my childhood home. I had countless memories there. But I also knew something else. Every decision that led them there had been their own. Eventually, Dad called me for the first time since the court case ended. His voice sounded completely different. The confidence was gone. He admitted I'd been right about the gallery from the very beginning. Then he confessed they were on the verge of losing the house. After a long silence, he asked one question. "Does it make you feel good watching us go through this?" I answered honestly. "No. I'm not happy you're losing your home. But I'm not surprised either. You borrowed money you couldn't afford to gamble on a business that never made financial sense." Dad sighed. Then he admitted something I'd suspected all along. They had hoped everything would somehow work out. Or that eventually I'd feel guilty enough to rescue them. I reminded him of something I'd said months earlier. Hope has never been a financial strategy. Over the next several weeks, something strange happened. Suddenly, everyone wanted to apologize. Mom admitted filing the lawsuit had been a terrible mistake. Rose mailed me a long handwritten letter explaining that while her dream had been genuine, she now understood her planning hadn't been. Even Aunt Patricia and my cousin Jake suddenly reached out, acting as though they genuinely wanted to repair our relationships. Then, one day, my old neighbor Mrs. Kim quietly warned me about something. She told me my parents had been asking people about my work schedule. They'd also been trying to find out whether I still lived alone. That immediately made me suspicious. A few days later, I pulled into my driveway after work and saw exactly what she'd been warning me about. My parents and Rose were already waiting outside my house. They greeted me with smiles and another round of heartfelt apologies. For nearly half an hour, they talked about forgiveness, rebuilding trust, and bringing our family back together. I listened without interrupting. Deep down, I already knew this visit wasn't really about reconciliation. Eventually, Dad finally admitted the truth. They were about to lose the house. They had found a duplex they wanted to rent. Then, he quickly added that they weren't asking me for money. Not directly. All they needed, he explained, was for me to co-sign the lease because the landlord wanted someone with stronger financial qualifications. I stared at all three of them, completely speechless. I honestly couldn't believe what I was hearing. After spending an entire year trying to tear apart everything I'd worked so hard to build, they were now asking me to become legally responsible for their rent. I didn't hesitate. No. It was the easiest decision I'd made throughout this entire ordeal. If you've really learned from everything that's happened, I told them, then you shouldn't need someone else to guarantee your financial responsibilities. Mom immediately broke into tears. Rose looked at me with anger. So you're really going to let your own family become homeless? I shook my head. You're not in this position because of me. You're dealing with the consequences of your own decisions. Then I repeated the same thing I'd been saying from the beginning. I'm not risking my future to fix problems you created yourselves. For the first time in months, none of them argued. They simply turned around, walked back to their car, and drove away without another word. 2 weeks later, Mrs. Kim told me the foreclosure had finally become unavoidable. My parents packed their belongings in the middle of the night and quietly left the house where I'd grown up. That was the last chapter of our story together. 2 years have passed since that conversation. Today, I'm writing this while sitting in the sunroom of my duplex, looking out over the garden I planted shortly after moving in. Every time I sit here, I'm reminded that protecting my future was the right decision. Buying the duplex turned out to be one of the smartest financial choices I've ever made. My upstairs tenant pays $1,200 every month, covering most of my mortgage while the property continues building equity. About 6 months ago, I left my full-time position at the hospital and started working as a freelance nurse through several staffing agencies. The flexibility completely changed my life. I decide when I work. I take time off whenever I need it. And because my housing costs are so much lower now, I actually earn more than I did working full-time. Not long after that, I completed a medical writing course. Now, I regularly write articles for healthcare publications, combining my nursing experience with another reliable source of income. Little by little, I kept improving the property. I remodeled the kitchen, expanded the backyard garden. I even started growing fresh herbs that I now sell to several local restaurants. Financially, I've never been in a stronger position. Over time, Mrs. Kim and a few mutual acquaintances filled me in on what eventually happened to my family. Just as Dad had warned, they lost the house through foreclosure. The bank sold it for less than the remaining mortgage balance, leaving them buried under even more debt. With their credit destroyed, finding another place to live became incredibly difficult. Eventually, they rented a small apartment across town because very few landlords were willing to approve them. Dad had to retire earlier than he'd planned after years of warehouse work became too physically demanding. Now, he works part-time at a hardware store while collecting reduced retirement benefits. Mom still works at a department store, but together they struggle just to keep up with everyday bills. After the gallery failed, Rose moved back in with our parents. That arrangement didn't last long. Constant arguments about money drove everyone apart again within a matter of months. Later, she moved in with a boyfriend. That relationship also ended after he discovered just how much debt she was carrying. The last update I heard was that she was working at a coffee shop while renting a tiny studio apartment she could barely afford. The failed gallery remained the only business experience listed on her resume. It had survived just 8 months. They also continued making monthly payments toward the court judgment for my legal fees. At one point, I even asked Marcus not to pursue wage garnishment. I wasn't interested in revenge. I only wanted them to fulfill the legal responsibility they'd created for themselves. According to Mrs. Kim, my parents still tell people that I abandoned them during their time of need. Even after everything that happened, they still can't admit that their own decisions caused their financial collapse. Instead, they continue blaming me for refusing to finance Rose's dream, as though that had ever been a responsible investment. I stopped trying to correct people a long time ago. The people who truly know me already know what really happened. I don't celebrate the hardships my family went through, but I don't carry guilt anymore either. Every major decision they made, from demanding $120,000 to filing a baseless lawsuit to asking me to co-sign another financial obligation, had one thing in common. Each time, they tried to shift the consequences of their choices onto me. Each time, I refused. And every one of those decisions protected the future I'd spent years creating. Sometimes I still wonder whether things could have turned out differently for Rose. Maybe if she'd spent years learning the business. Maybe if she'd started with a realistic budget. Maybe if she'd chosen a better location and accepted slower growth. Under different circumstances, perhaps she really could have built a successful gallery one day. But that isn't the path she chose. She wanted instant success, funded by someone else's sacrifice, instead of earning it through patience and experience. I chose financial security over family pressure. Looking back now, I've never regretted that choice. Losing my family hurt. There's no denying that. But eventually, I realized something important. The relationships I lost only existed as long as I was willing to sacrifice my own future for theirs. The moment I stopped doing that, those relationships disappeared. That told me they had never been built on mutual respect in the first place. Today, I have something far more valuable. I have peace of mind. I have independence. I have financial security. I travel when I want. I work because I choose to, not because I'm trapped. And with every responsible decision I make, I continue building a stronger future. The greatest lesson this experience taught me wasn't simply how to protect my money. It taught me how to protect my boundaries. Financial independence isn't just about having savings in the bank or owning property. It's about having the courage to defend everything you've worked for, even when the people closest to you expect you to hand it over. 2 years later, I'm thriving because I refused to let anyone else decide what my future was worth. 3 years after those courthouse doors closed behind me, I found myself driving through my old neighborhood for the first time in a long while. As I passed my childhood home, I barely recognized it. The faded siding had been replaced with fresh paint. Colorful flower beds lined the walkway. Children's bicycles rested in the driveway. A young family had filled the place with new memories. Instead of feeling sadness, I caught myself smiling. That chapter of my life had finally come to an end. Meanwhile, my own life continued moving forward. The following year, after another carefully researched investment, I purchased the neighboring property. Adding a second rental unit created yet another dependable stream of income. My freelance nursing career continued growing because I could choose assignments that challenged me professionally without sacrificing my personal life. The medical writing I'd once treated as a side project gradually became a thriving business of its own. As that income grew, I was able to reduce my hospital shifts even further. For the first time in my entire life, my schedule was no longer controlled by financial stress. Instead, it was shaped by my own choices. And after everything I'd been through, there was no greater freedom than that. I finally started visiting places I'd only imagined seeing, back when I was stuck working endless double shifts at the hospital. Instead of lying awake worrying about bills, I spent quiet mornings in my garden with a cup of coffee, watching the sun come up. One by one, the goals I'd written down years earlier in a worn-out notebook stopped being dreams and became my everyday reality. None of it happened because I got lucky. It happened because I stayed disciplined when it mattered most, even when making the right choice was the hardest thing to do. Every now and then, I'd hear updates about my family through mutual friends or former neighbors. From what I was told, they were still living in the same apartment they'd rented after losing the house, and money was still a constant struggle. Dad's health had continued to decline. Mom was still working long after the retirement she'd always imagined for herself. As for Rose, she was still behind the counter at the same coffee shop. Apparently, she no longer talked about opening art galleries or becoming a business owner. Life had finally taught her the lessons that no amount of someone else's money ever could. Then, one afternoon, something unexpected showed up in my mailbox. It was a plain envelope with no return letter inside. The only thing it contained was the receipt showing the final payment on the court judgment. After years of making small monthly installments, my parents had finally paid back every dollar they owed for my legal fees. There wasn't a handwritten note, no apology, no explanation, no attempt to reconnect, just a receipt. I looked at it for a moment, folded it carefully, placed it inside my filing cabinet, and quietly closed the drawer. As I did, I realized something. That piece of paper marked the very last financial tie that still connected us. From that day forward, there was nothing left unresolved. Every so often, someone asks whether I regret choosing money over my family. My answer has never changed. I didn't choose money over family. I chose responsibility over entitlement, planning over wishful thinking, accountability over manipulation. And I chose to protect the future I'd spent years building instead of sacrificing it to satisfy someone else's unrealistic expectations. Real families celebrate each other's achievements. They don't demand ownership of someone else's success. They don't use guilt as a weapon. And they certainly don't drag each other into court because someone refuses to finance a reckless dream. Love should never come with invoices. It shouldn't involve lawsuits. And it should never require impossible obligations. Looking back now, I realize something that never occurred to me at the time. Selling my apartment wasn't the greatest investment I ever made. The greatest investment was believing that my years of hard work actually mattered, and refusing to let anyone convince me that I owed the rewards of that work to someone else. That single decision gave me far more than financial security. It gave me confidence. It gave me independence. It gave me peace of mind. Most importantly, it gave me the freedom to build a life based on my own choices, instead of living according to someone else's demands. Sometimes the most painful thing you lose isn't money or even relationships. Sometimes it's the belief that your family will always do the right thing. But every once in a while, letting go of that illusion is exactly what allows you to build the life you were meant to have. And looking back now, I wouldn't change that decision for anything.